Today I shall give you an overview of one of the greatest poems of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This poem was composed in 1922 and it is one of the foundational texts of modernism in English literature. The poem is a long one, divided into 5 parts, and it was edited by another major poet of the time, Ezra Pound. The central theme of the poem is the broken psyche of modern man. The World War, the First World War, the rapid industrialization and urbanization had inflicted severe damage on the psyche of modern man at the beginning of the 20th century. This poem portrays the fragmented, damaged psyche of modern man, which was a characteristic experience of the 20th century. The title of the poem is important, The Wasteland. At least 3 wastelands are alluded to the title. The first one is the wasteland in the Oedipus myth. Then there is the biblical wasteland mentioned in the Ecclesiastes and Ezekiel. And most importantly, the wasteland discussed in the anthropologist Jesse Weston's book From Ritual to Romance. And the Holy Grail is the vessel used by Christ at the time of Last Supper. And later, Joseph of Arimathea collected his blood in this grail. And in the medieval period, there were grail worships in Europe. And one day, the Holy Grail disappeared mysteriously from the chapel where it had been kept, along with a long pointed lance that had been used to pierce the body of Christ. And people believed that this Holy Grail had medicinal and mystical powers. So many knights undertook expeditions in search of the lost Holy Grail. One such search was conducted by a French knight called Sir Percival. Percival wandered a lot in search of the Holy Grail, and during his wanderings he reached a sterile wasteland which was ruled by a maimed and impotent king called the Fisher King. And Percival later discovered that the land had become sterile because of a curse, because there was a chapel in that country called Chapel Perilous. And one day some of the soldiers of the king of the country molested some nuns who belonged to the chapel. As a result of this, a curse fell upon the land, and thus the land was turned into a wasteland and the king became sexually impotent. Or in other words, the sterility of the land is an externalization of the impotency of the king. So these 3 wastelands are alluded to the title. And then the protagonist of the poem is also important. The protagonist of the poem is a mythical character, the Theban prophet Tiresias. Tiresias as a character is with immense possibility, and several stories were about Tiresias. And Tiresias was a Theban youth, and one day he secretly watched goddess Athena taking bath in a pond. So the goddess caught him and struck him blind. But Tiresias' mother happened to be a devotee of the goddess, and she begged for forgiveness, and as a compensation the goddess granted him the ability to foresee things, and also she bestowed on him immortality. Thus Tiresias became a blind prophet who is immortal also. And on another occasion, maybe prior to this, while he was walking through a forest, he came across two snakes mating. He took a stick and hit them. Then the snakes pronounced a curse upon him, and as a result he was turned into a woman. A few years later, once again he came across two snakes mating, and this time too he hit them with a stick, and another curse was pronounced upon him. As a result, once again he was turned into a man. So he lived part of his life as man and part of his life as woman. So in short, we can say that he is bisexual. Then on another story about Tiresias is that once there broke out a quarrel between the supreme god Jove and Juno, and the subject of their quarrel was who would get greater pleasure in sex, man or woman. And the only person who could answer this question was Tiresias, and so Tiresias was summoned. And Tiresias said that it would be the woman. So Juno became angry, and again she too pronounced a curse upon him, and as a result he was sent to the world of the dead. After a few years, Jove restored him to the earth. Thus he lived part of his life in this world and part of his life in the other world. So thus Tiresias as a character is with immense possibility. He is a multi-perspectival figure. He is blind, prophetic, immortal, bisexual, had lived in this world and in the other world, and so he is at the center of the poem. And Eliot himself once said that he is an all-inclusive consciousness, and what he sees is the substance of the poem. This is the importance of the protagonist. And the poem has an epigraph also, a few Latin lines taken from Satyricon by Petronius. And in Satyricon, a character called Trimalchio once told the story of the Sibyl of Cumae to his friends to amuse them. And in ancient Greece, Sibyls were women with prophetic power. And there was a very famous Sibyl at that time called the Sibyl of Cumae. She was from the place called Cumae. And she was a favorite of god Apollo, and one day the god appeared before her and asked her what she wanted. In excitement, she told him that she should never die. But this later turned out to be a curse, because she had forgotten to ask for perpetual youth. Years passed. She became hundreds of years old, and her body became decayed and decomposed, and she was afflicted with all infirmities of old age. And she really, at that time, she really wished to die. So people put her in a cage. Sometimes children would approach her with a question, "Oh Sibyl, what do you want?" Then she would reply, "I want to die." So this is the epigraph of the poem. So this epigraph gives us a glimpse of what we are going to study, what we are going to read in the poem. The death in life of modern civilization. And the poem is dedicated to Ezra Pound, who revised the poem for Ezra Pound, Il Miglio Fabbro, which means a better craftsman. So the poem is dedicated to Ezra Pound, a better craftsman. This poem is divided into 5 sections. The first section of the poem is entitled The Burial of the Dead. This subtitle is also significant. It alludes to the burial service of the Church of England, and more importantly, it alludes to the vegetation cults and fertility myths or vegetation cults mentioned in another anthropological book, The Golden Bough by James Fraser. And in the Golden Bough, James Fraser had discussed the stories of Adonis, Attis, Osiris, the fertility gods who belonged to the ancient Greek, Egyptian and Babylonian civilizations. And there were fertility rituals in these cultures, civilizations. And as part of the fertility cult, these ancient people would make enormous effigies of the fertility god, which were decorated with different kinds of seeds. And in the middle of March, they would carry the effigy ceremoniously to the next river bank, to the nearby river bank. There they would either immerse the effigy in water or bury the effigy on the banks of the river, suggesting the death of the fertility god. And after a few days, with the coming of April, the seeds in the effigies would sprout, suggesting the resurrection of the fertility god. And so, this poem, this section, the burial of the dead, suggests the idea that the burial of the dead is not an end in itself, it anticipates a rebirth. And this section is divided into 5 episodes. The first episode, or we can say that it is divided into 5 episodes. Each stanza can be considered as an episode. The first episode begins with a parody of the first lines of Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of dead land, mixing memory and desire with dull roots of spring rain. So, in Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales, April is described as a month full of positive energy. It is the month of Easter, it is a month of spring, it is full of positive energy, and this is how Chaucer portrayed April in prologue to the Canterbury Tales. But here, as a parody of those lines, he said, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of dead land. So this can be the opinion of a typical wastelander who had got accustomed to his dull life in the wasteland, and he does not like a rebirth or a revival. So to him, April is the cruelest month. It brings to him the memories of his resurrection, rebirth, and the need for a revival. And in the same episode, we can see a typical wastelander in the character Mary L'Arche, a German countess, who, like a migratory bird, moves from one part of the world to another in search of pleasure. The second episode of this section starts with 2 rhetorical questions. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot answer my question. This is how the second episode starts. The Son of Man may be a reference to Christ. So, in this episode, we can see a description of the geographical features of the wasteland. It is a stony rubbish. It nourishes no roots. The sun beats and the cricket gives no relief. And there is only a dead tree that gives no shelter to the people. Then there is a huge red rock. Thus, the narrator shows us the important physical, geographical features of the wasteland. The third episode starts with a German chord, Frisch wird der Wind, der Heimat zu, meine Eidechkind, wo weilest du. This is taken from a German drama, a German opera, Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner. So in this section, we can see the sharp contrast between the lovers of mythology and modern lovers. So in modern time, love has degenerated into sex. In the fourth episode, a character is introduced, Madame Sosostris, a character from Huxley's Chromiolo. Madame Sosostris is a clairvoyant, a fortune teller, and she is with a pack of tarot cards. When she saw the narrator, Tiresias, she showed him the picture of a drowned Phoenician sailor and warned him, here is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. fear death by water. Death by water is suggestive of salvation. And this episode is structurally important because almost all the important characters of the poem are introduced in this episode as images shown on the tarot cards. Here is Belladonna, the Lady of Rocks, then the one-eyed merchant, the old man with 3 staffs, the hanged man, the blank card. All these are introduced as images shown on the tarot cards. And the last episode of the first section describes urban life, the death in life of the urban life. And so it starts with the line, unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. And these lines carry some associations from Charles Baudelaire's poem. So the city is unreal because life is lived only on the physical plane in the modern city. It can be any city, London, Jerusalem, Athens, Vienna, or Paris, or any modern city, modern metropolis. And people are moving like automatons, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, and I had not thought death had undone so many. And then the narrator spotted a person whom he knew, and he stopped him. Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Maila, the corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence, that's a friend to man, or with his nails he will dig it up again. So Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Maila, the narrator had met him in the ships at Maila. Remember, Maila battle was fought in 260 BC, which means they were meeting again after more than 2000 years, which means both of them are immortal. And we know that Tiresias is immortal. Then who is Stetson? Stetson is the representative of the whole humanity, the whole human race that had survived all the wars in the world, all the wars in the world, in world history. And so the corpse that he planted in his garden is suggestive of the spiritual death of modern man. And then the writer has created certain traps of interpretation here. So Stetson, the corpse that Stetson planted in his garden is suggestive of the spiritual death, the spiritual failure of modern man. And then he said, oh, keep the dog far hence, that's a friend to man. So dog. So here dog is the third word in that line, keep the dog far hence, but the D is capitalized. And this is with a purpose. On one interpretation is that it refers to the constellation dog, but we can add another interpretation to this. Dog is an anagram of God, and in the next line it is said, with his nails he will dig it up again. And he deliberately used the word nails instead of claws, because nails carry another association, maybe the nails used for crucifixion. So this writer had prepared a kind of trap here for the reader. And this section, this episode ends with again a French quote from Charles Baudelaire, you hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. You hypocritical reader, you are my brother and you are my friend. This is the first section of the Wasteland. The second section of the Wasteland is entitled A Game of Chess. So this subtitle is also important. The Game of Chess alludes to a play with the same title by Thomas Middleton, and Game of Chess this section has two, we can divide this section into two. The first half describes the dressing room of a rich aristocratic lady, and this section also starts with a parody of Enobarbar's description of Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra. So this section begins with the lines, "The chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble." The original lines in Antony and Cleopatra were, "The bath she sat in like a burnished throne burned on water." So here, "The chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble." And here we can see the picturesque description of the dressing room, the rich dressing room of that lady. She was sitting in front of the mirror, a huge mirror held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, and then there was a 7-branched candelabra in front of the mirror, and the mirror doubled the flames of the 7-branched candelabra, and it was framed with fruited vines. Then there are images of Cupid, different images of Cupid. Then her jewelry items were also scattered on the table, and there were synthetic perfumes. Then there was a beautiful hearth framed by colored glass. Then a huge antique mantelpiece which portrayed the story of the change of Philomel. And so every minute detail of this room is described in a very vivid manner. But ironically enough, not a single word about the woman sitting in front of the mirror. Then this description of the room is interpreted by footsteps shuffled on the stair. Maybe her lover is coming, and then it is followed by some neurotic outbursts of the woman. And the second half of the section describes another experience. The narrator invites our attention to a pub where some low class, say working class women gathered there, and it was the closing hour. They were evidently gossiping about a company, one of their companions, Lil. And so her husband, Lil's husband, got demobbed, discharged from the army recently, and he is coming back, and they were discussing about Lil and her ugly lifestyle. And in this episode, in this section, we can see the bartender's impatient cry, "Hurry up, please! It's time! Hurry up, please! It's time!" And finally, the woman stood up and said, "Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night, Bill. Tata. Good night." Then, "Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night." So these last lines of the second section are taken from Hamlet. It is Ophelia's farewell to the world. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. So thus, as a whole, this section, the game of chess, has a Shakespearean framework. It begins and ends with two Shakespeare cards. Begins with a parody of Enobarbar's description of Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra, and ends with Ophelia's farewell to the world. And another feature of this section is that this is a section where all the important characters are women. And so this section is populated with domed female characters from history, from mythology, and from literature. And in the first half, we can see the picturesque description of the room where the lady was sitting, but not a single word about the woman. So it can be any woman. She can be any woman. She is a multi-perspectival woman, maybe a cubistic portrait of a multi-perspectival woman. She can be any woman. And so that means she is absent in the narrative, which means in the first section we can see the absence of a presence, but in the second half Lil is not physically present there, but she is present in the narrative. So we can say that there we can see the presence of an absence. So thus this section offers a lot of possibilities for interpretation. The third section of the Wasteland is entitled The Fire Sermon, and this section deals with, this title alludes to Buddha's sermon on the fires of lust, anger and malice. And this section begins with a description of the bank of river Thames in winter, and during summer several pleasure seeking young men and women spend their summer nights on the bank of river Thames, and then they would gift the river with a lot of waste items. But now it is winter and the river bank is no longer visited by such people, and so the narrator says the river bears no handkerchiefs, cigarette ends, cardboard boxes or other testimony of summer nights. Then borrowing a line from Protagonist, Spenser's Protagonist, he said, "Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song." Then the writer invites our attention to another scene, and he is fishing in the Dull Canal, and then he could hear the sound of horns of motor cars, and he said that Mr. Sweeney is going to Mrs. Potter's house. In Eliot's poetry, Mr. Sweeney is a sex hungry man and Mrs. Potter may be his feminine counterpart. And then the writer or the narrator again takes us to another scene, and he says that it is the evening hour when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing waiting. And the human engines, so here the writer describes the mechanical lifestyle of the modern people. They are waiting like a taxi throbbing waiting at the offices. And here the narrator says, "I Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts." So what is significant here is that it is the first ever direct mention of the name of the protagonist. It is in this occasion that he mentioned his name, Tiresias, and then he describes the experiences of a typist, and she was back at her room after office hours, and she cleared her breakfast, and he laid out food in tins, and then she had a small meal, and then she waited for somebody, maybe her lover, and after a few minutes he came. He, the young man Carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk, one of the law on whom assurance sits like a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. At once he assaults on her, and his exploring hands encounter no defense, and his vanity requires no response, and thus they indulged in sex, and after that he left without saying a word. And see how sex has become mechanical in the modern world. And what was her response? She said, "Well, that is done and I am glad it is over," and then she puts a record on the gramophone. So the music from the gramophone soon metamorphosed into the songs of three Thames daughters, three nymphs who were supposed to be the daughters of river Thames. They sang about the river sweats oil and tar. Then they sang how they had been undone in the modern world. And this section ends with a few lines from Saint Augustine's Confessions. To Carthage then I came, burning, burning, burning. O Lord, thou pluck'st me out. O Lord, thou pluck'st burning. So, what is special about this section is that there is a paradoxical situation here. The title of the section is Fire Sermon, but the major imagery used in this section is that of water. And all the characters in this section, the pleasure seeking couples who spend their summer nights on the river bank, then Mr. Sweeney, Mrs. Potter, Tiresias himself, the typist, the clerk, the Thames daughters, all of them are burning with lust in this section. The fourth section of the Wasteland is entitled Death by Water. This is the shortest section of the poem. Death by Water. In this section, the narrator said that Phlebas the finished in a fortnight dead and forgot the cry of gulls. So, here he describes the drowning of a Phoenician sailor called Phlebas. And again, now we can take this to the first section where Mother Sosostris warned Tiresias with that card of the drowned Phoenician sailor, fear death by water. So, here is death by water of Phlebas the Phoenician. And what is important about this section is that this section is with a closural effect. So, thus by putting a section with closural effect in the penultimate position, the poet is making fun of the very notion of closure in literature. And the last section of the Wasteland is entitled What the Thunder Said. And this subtitle again, this title too alludes to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. And in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, there is a story of creation. The supreme god Prajapati created three orders of being: gods, demons, and man. First he created gods, and then gods approached him with the question, O Lord, what is our duty? Then Prajapati said, Dha. The gods interpreted it as Damyada, self-control. And then the Asuras or the demons approached him, and to them also Prajapati said Dha, and they interpreted it as Dayatvam, to show sympathy, sympathize with others. And finally man approached him. To man also Prajapati said Dha, and man interpreted it as Datta. That means to give oneself over to a noble cause, self-dedication. So, these are the three advices: Datta, Dayatvam, and Damyada. And it is said in the Upanishads that the sound of thunder reminds the people of this threefold advice of Prajapati. And the first stanza of this section describes the course of events from the betrayal of Christ to his crucifixion. After the torchlight adorned sweaty faces, so people coming to arrest Christ, he was taken to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he said, He who was living is now dead, and we who were living are now dying with a little patience. So that was the condition of modern civilization. And then in the next stanza, the narrator describes the last part of the journey of the coster, Sir Percival, the last part of the journey of Percival in search of the Holy Grail. And it is said in the legend that he was climbing a hill to reach Chapel Perilous, where he hoped to see the Holy Grail. And he was climbing the hill, and here in the poem it is said, "Here is no water but only rock and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water." And this desire for water is intensified step by step. A little later he said, "If there were water and also rock." Then again he said, "If there were the sound of water only." And this desire is more intensified in the lines, "The hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip drop, 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 but there is no water." Hermit thrush song anticipates rain. So this is how the desire for water is intensified in these lines. Desire for water is definitely the desire for a remedy for the spiritual maladies of modern man. And then the narrator takes us to another scene where two disciples of Christ were on their way to Emmaus, the evil land of Emmaus. Then the narrator describes the picture of a neurotic woman who drew out her locks and fiddled whisper music on those strings. And then the narrator says that the narrator describes the last part of the journey of the coster. He had reached his destination, but to his dismay he said, "This is the empty chapel, only the wind's home." And that was the realization. It was the empty chapel, it was only the wind's home, and only a cock stood on the roof tree, and it crowed, and then a damp gust bringing rain. And then he said, "Ganga was sunken, and the limb leaves waited for rain." And then spoke the thunder, "Dha, Datta, what have we given?" Then here the narrator says that we are living in an age of practical wisdom, practicalities, and how can we dedicate ourselves to a noble cause in this situation? Dha, Dayatvam. So here again the narrator says that we have shut ourselves within the prison house of our ego, and we have thrown away the key. And then in such a situation, how can we sympathize with our fellow beings? Dha, Damyada, the boat responded gaily to Hans' expert. So here the narrator says that let us entrust this boat with some Hans' expert. So the boat is symbolic of life itself, and the expert hand may refer to God. Maybe this may be taken from a metaphor taken from Bhagavad Gita, where the reign, the control is with God, and that is why the Pandavas emerged successful in the battle. So let us entrust this boat with Hans' expert, then the sea would be obedient to controlling hands, Damyada, self-control. And then in the last stanza of the poem, he said, I sat upon the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my land in order? The last stanza of the poem starts with the line, I sat upon the shore, fishing, with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my land in order? Pues asco se nel foco sheglia fina. Quantum fiamuti sheliden, swallow, swallow. La pransta kita ala tu aboli. These fragments I have shot against my ruins. When I'll fit you. Hieronimo is mad again. Detta, Dethum, Damyada, Shanti, Shanti, Shantihi. This is how the poem ends. So, here, according to some critics, in this last stanza, the protagonist is, the narrator or the protagonist is preparing for his death by water. And this is evident in the line, shall I at least set my land in order? And the foreign courts are suggestive of the need for a revival or a resurrection. And Hieronimo is mad again, taken from kids' play, Spanish tragedy. And Detta, Dethum, Damyada, Shanti, Shanti, Shantihi. It is not sure whether it really rained at the end of the poem. But if you are optimistic, you can see a lot of positive, a series of positive signs in the last section of the Wasteland. The crowing of the cock is suggestive of rebirth. Then the damp gust bringing rain, then lightning, thunder, and the next will be rain. And so here in the line, shall I at least set my land in order? And so here the protagonist is preparing for his death by water. And then the Shanti mantra, Shanti, Shanti, Shantihi, suggests that drizzling has already been started. So thus the poem ends ambiguously, but again, if you are optimistic, you can definitely say it ends optimistically too. And now, what are the major themes of the poem? So this is one of the foundational texts of modernism, and this poem is broken, fragmented, disjunctive and anti-narrative. One of the main criticism against the poem after its publication in 1922 was that it is a heap of broken images. So many critics like Louis Untermeyer considered the poem as a set of separate poems, and the early criticisms of the poem were about the fragmented nature of poetry of this poem. But we should remember one thing, that this poem is about the broken, damaged psyche of modern men. Then how can we expect the writer to write about the broken psyche by using the discourses of unity? And here the writer invites us to make meaning out of fragments. That is a characteristic feature of modernist poetry. And again, most of the commentators have overlooked the fragmentary bits in search of the unity or the totality that it might have been. And they often envisage the poem as a pilgrimage, as a quest for the Holy Grail, and as an elegy for Europe. But all such interpretations treat the poem as if it were a photographic negative. What is charming about the poem is its fragmentary nature, because this is a poem, a statement about the broken, fragmented psyche of modern man. And this poem is about the collapse of values in Western civilization, the collapse of values in Western civilization, which was definitely a byproduct of urbanization and industrialization. So, this is reflected in, this collapse of values is reflected in unloving sexual relationships discussed in the poem. And the source of all this spiritual malady is definitely the inability of the modern man to make meaning out of fragments. And the poem is, according to Dr. F.R. Lewis, the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. So, this is how F.R. Lewis puts it, the poem as the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. And this is a poem about, as we have already said, the psychological breakdown of human beings in the beginning of the 20th century. The text itself is hysteric, and perhaps this is the most hysteric of all literary texts. The hysteric somatizes her desire, and the hysteric suffers from reminiscences, and in the same way the poem too suffers from reminiscences. And there are silences between lines. It is in these silences that meaning flickers, and these silences between the lines curtail the power of the author, and these silences invite the reader, to make meaning out of fragments. Like every other modernist poem or modernist literary work, seeing and perception is central to this poem also. As the poet has already said, Tiresias is an all-inclusive consciousness, and what he sees is the substance of the poem. And Tiresias is the disembodied narrator of the poem, and this disembodied I glides in and out of borrowed texts. And he is the victim of the general collapse of boundaries. And according to Yulia Kristeva, this poem is one of the most abject poems of literature. What is abject? According to Kristeva, the abject emerges when expulsions fail. Waste is something a culture casts away to define what it is. But when such expulsions fail, there is a collapse of boundary, a collapse of boundaries between what we need and what we do not need. And here in this poem too, we can see this collapse of boundaries, and thus the poem becomes the most abject poem in literature. And the poem portrays the tragedy of the abject, and this is the characteristic experience of modern civilization also. We fail to expel what we do not need, and so this failure will ultimately result in the collapse of the boundary between what we need and what we do not need. And the phenomenal text of the poem hides a multiplicity of meanings, and we shall conclude with a quote from the critic Terry Eagleton. And Terry Eagleton once said that behind this phenomenal text of fragmented pieces, there is a discourse of coherence. There is a discourse of coherence created by the mythologies that frame it, the mythologies that frame the poem. So he said that, like a burglar distracting the guard dog before he proceeds to his stealthy business, the phenomenal text of the poem invites the reader to interpret itself, but defies whatever interpretations that we can offer to the poem. Thank you.